Emotional intelligence. Three men talking about emotional intelligence.
I had the thought. I had the thought.
Sounds like a joke. Sounds like three men walk into a
Three
bar.
guys walk into a bar. All right, we're here. let's get it rolling. Brody, roll the credits. From Sydney, Australia, all the way to Portland, USA, two misfits hang out after class to riff on the B-sides of professional life. These are your professional misfits. All the way from Sydney, Australia, I am your host, Christopher Sellers.
Portland, Oregon, I'm Brody Ipox.
And we are your professional misfits, where we riff on the B-sides of professional life. And today, Misfits on Season 4, on Episode 7, we're talking about emotional intelligence and does it matter? What is it? Does it matter? There's a lot of hype. And I brought a book writing friend, Melo Calarco. Lovely to see you in person.
Likewise, good to be here. Excited about this catch up. Good to catch up with you guys.
Perfect. Thanks for dropping by. Author of Beating Burnout, Finding Balance. I've got that written here. You just happen to have a copy.
Oh, yes.
What are the odds? What are the odds? Malo, how would you address the public? How do you represent yourself? Like, what is it you do? Why did we bring you here? Why does emotional intelligence matter in respect to burnout?
Sure. So my formal title, I guess, is I'm a mindfulness and high performance coach, and that's how people understand the work that I do. And I run a lot of seminars and workshops, around mindfulness and resilience and burnout and all these topics, including emotional intelligence. My informal title, I guess, is sometimes they call me Melo Yellow sometimes.
Quite likely.
That song. Or sometimes Mellow by name, Mellow by nature. So I'm a pretty mellow guy. Mindfulness, obviously, the meditation is a big part of the work that I do, which rolls right into meditation and self-awareness and emotional intelligence.
And you've just done a TEDx talk, am I right?
Yeah, it's just a few weeks ago. Yeah, still riding the high of that. It was a pretty emotional roller coaster, to be honest. The lead up to it and the intensity of the build up, to get up on that stage and share my big idea, which I changed a few times and honed and crafted and polished until it became the talk that I wanted to do. And yeah, it was awesome. Awesome.
What was your big idea?
The big idea was around creating space between the stimulus and response. So there's a space, something happens to you and then we react or respond. So it's about the space between. And I share a couple of stories in that talk around where I had to meditate for 12 hours in a storm to survive a near-death experience, and also another experience in Rwanda in Africa when I had a machine gun in my ribs and I had to create that space between stimulus and response. But I won't give you too many spoilers. I'll let you listen to the TEDx soon. Right.
Yeah. I was going to say, save it, like buy the book it and come talk. So here we are, emotional intelligence. I'm not quite sure where to start because it's sort of a vague sort of topic. I know for my book, Applied Creativity, I wrote an entire chapter on emotional intelligence being a creative skill set and why it's important. I'm also aware that most of the world doesn't operate by creative standards. But what is interesting when we look at sort of the professional landscape is emotional intelligence in general is just spoken about in regards to empathy. Like, that's the tip of this iceberg. That's all we need it for. So I guess this is a decent place to start of like, how do we define something like emotional intelligence and why does it matter? So Brody Ipox, as a co-host to this and to save the guest, I'm going to push you onto this emotional intelligence bus first. How would you define it? How would you get a grasp on, we need emotional intelligence, and some of this, like, why, what for, what is it?
Yeah, so I mean, we've had an episode this season that kind of like gave a little window into my perspective on that, and I feel like a large portion of it for me is communication and those kind of different facets of communication that I was talking about. Before, when we had talked about this coming up, I went and looked up the definition, and I mean, not that it sits exactly the same as it's written, but a lot of it really hits home for me, and I think it's well defined. I think a lot of people that have worked on self-awareness and that kind of emotional intelligence have it figured out. So, emotional intelligence is defined as the capacity to recognize, understand, and manage one's emotion, as well as recognize, understand, and influence the emotion of others. There's 5 components for emotional intelligence, which are self-awareness, self-regulation, social awareness, relationship management, and empathy. And yeah, like I said, the construct of it makes a lot of sense to me. I think there's like pieces in there that seem a little redundant in my opinion, but yeah, I don't know. That's a pretty damn solid definition, if you ask
All right,
me.
I'm going to foreshadow. I want everyone to remember those 4 little categories.
5.
5. Thank
Yep.
you. Those 5 categories for my rant, which I know is coming later. So,
Yeah.
but I think it's a solid place to start. But more to my point, you'll notice if there's 5 categories of emotional intelligence, you'll notice one of them is empathy, and only that one is spoken about in professional contexts. Melo, where does emotional intelligence sit with you? And maybe specifically, like, how is it even relevant to burnout in corporate spaces?
Yeah. For me, it's twofold. There's two areas that I look at, and I'll start with the first one being in the corporate space where I do a fair bit of work. And when I do ask the question in some of my seminars, and I ask, the collective in the room, and it might be a group of leaders, it might be a group of managers, and a whole range of different people, and I ask, what is emotional intelligence and why is it important? Typically, the response I get will be something like empathy, like you said, having empathy, but it also be like how to read the room, how to get along with others, how to communicate with others, how to speak better with others, how to lead others better. And most people will lead with that, but for me, they're missing the most important part. Number one is yourself first. So it all starts with you. So really forget about the other part. Don't even worry about the other part unless you know yourself better. So the very first step to emotional intelligence is your own self-awareness, understanding yourself on a deeper level, understanding your goals, understanding your values, what you stand for, understanding your intentions, your responses, your behaviors, how you manage your emotions or how you understand your emotions. Forget about part 2 unless we get part 1 right. And then the second part is how that interacts with others around you.
Solid breakdown. I'll get to my definition later. It's
Why? Why do
no,
you
okay,
get to...
it's okay. No, all right. So no, it's sort of in line with your Google dictionary definition. I think it was interesting because, like, to understand like your emotional process, but more importantly, and this is something I'm going to talk about, is how to regulate and affect and impact the emotions of others around you. That is, I'm going to draw an underline under that for a very specific reason later, because it is an entire sphere of emotional intelligence which I know isn't discussed and leads into an entirely different branch of types of intelligence and the way that creatives operate. That is in a vacuum when you look at anywhere in corporate, but that's I'm preempting a lot. But when tying into what Melo was saying in terms, like, the reason he goes in to do workshops on emotional intelligence is because someone in HR goes, we don't have any emotional intelligence, right? So we need to bring in someone that can educate the class and the masses on what this thing is and why we need it and its value to the organization. So what I'd like to discuss is maybe just some personal stories and some anecdotes. Like, B, have you ever been, like, either in a relationship or had like an occupational experience where there's a complete disconnect and it's just not working out, or someone is so emotionally retarded or disconnected and they got no clue what's going on?
Well, I mean,
let's be honest, it happens. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah. Well, I love that you made the reference. The thing is, I think I think there's a space for guys like Melo because the corporate space is so void of it. I think any time that I've ever been in a corporate contract, large scale team, I don't know whether it's the amount of people that influences that kind of, in my mind, just social retardation, but it happens. It happens. You get into environments, and I'll say this: I don't want to name the company because we're monetizing this season, so like let's be cautious here. But I worked for an extremely large tech company, and some of the shit that would happen just in that space was the disconnect for me. I would see people with inappropriate behaviors. I would see conversations that were just ridiculous to be having in a workspace. I'd see people taking action against certain people for the most obtuse reasons. Just shit, you just see it and you're like, where the fuck is all this fuckery coming from? Like
Can you give us a specific example?
Yeah, okay. So there's me and there's a group of leadership, and 3 interns came in. One of the interns was female, and all of the leadership guys super wildly fucking inappropriate. She was an attractive younger girl.
Oh, I remember this story. I think even from like season 1, early season 2. Yeah.
And I mean just shit that you're like, how are these guys thinking that they're number one gonna get away with this, and then number two to be in the position that they are and to do this, right? And that's where I'm bringing this up, because to me, if we're talking about emotional intelligence, you're fucking stupid if you think that people aren't watching you, and regardless if in a momentary like situation you can get away with it, that it's not going to come back and bite you in the ass later for the effect that you had emotionally on the people around you in that situation. And these guys were in leadership. I mean, leadership. I'm talking managers, upper management, and this is the way they were treating a female intern. And I was like, dude, no way would this happen in the contract space. If I was to come into a small company or small business, I'm a contract guy, I do my thing, and I'm fucking hitting on the receptionist or whatever it is, I'm fucking gone so fast. They would all protect that so quickly. And I've seen shit like that as well. Why in the corporate space is it so void and null? And I don't know if it's that people just are in a different mindset completely in that environment, or that it's it is a fully new environment and they just aren't adapted to it, and I again, that sounds strange, but one of the things that I wanted to bring up in this conversation is I wonder how many people are actually self-aware, and I truly mean that, and not in a shitty I'm above you because I'm self-aware kind of way. I mean, fuck, there was a statistic that I saw the other day that was something like 60% of people don't have an internal dialogue, or some crazy number like that. And I was like, that's what? You don't talk to yourself up here? Like, that's some fucking weird shit. And I think realistically, that's more the truth than it is people are just choosing not to be emotionally intelligent. They just don't have any capacity to understand that they are fucking doing the shit that they're doing because nobody's called it on them. I believe that in that situation that I was in that kind of environment, I'll look back and I'll say this: the one thing that wasn't emotionally intelligent of me was that regardless of how shitty I knew the situation was, I didn't speak up. I didn't make a impactful emotional effort on the other side of the fence, right? Where I could have saved this person from feeling alone, or I could have stood against people thinking that that was normal, whatever it was. And yeah, I think we all just have moments where it's kind of a lapse in being willing to look at ourselves again. And that's the self-awareness piece of it to me. So that's the instance, and I'll bring it up till the day I die because I just can't get over it. It was like something out of a fucking movie, like, and these guys were in the 1950s or some shit, like, and it was like, didn't know shit like that still exists, but all right, if we're going to nurture environments like that, okay.
Melo, does that sound
sometimes.
familiar?
Yeah, sometimes in the corporate space, people aren't their true selves either. Especially in the leadership team, they have to put on this front of being a leader and strong, and not show their vulnerabilities and all those sort of things. Or maybe they hold it together all day at work, and then they get home and they lose it, with their partner or whatever. So sometimes it's not the true representation. One of the guys that I was coaching as a general manager for a company, quite a large company. And one-on-one coaching, I go to his office and have a chat, and his emotional intelligence was a little bit flawed in the way that he had a team underneath him and around him, and he believed that his team loved him. Like my team love me. I go out for drinks, we play, we do things together, we catch up at sports events. I eventually was in that organization, in that company for a while, and I started coaching some of his team members. And they gave me the polar opposite.
Yeah, right.
Oh, he's manic. He's unapproachable. We can't speak to him. He's crazy. He's angry half of the time. All these sort of things. So his emotional intelligence and his awareness, of the environment around him was zero, absolutely zero. So the work I had to do with him was 101 self-awareness. Like, let's go right back to, forget about the other self-regulation. There was no ability to self-regulate because he wasn't even aware of it himself. And his perception. So often it's the perception of themselves.
Yeah.
And that's why we have to get an understanding of that first. So, great malalignment.
There's something practical that I want to tap into there. It's like, if you talk about, okay, we've got to start with self-awareness. In terms of a practical step, what would something like that look like? I'm curious to hear it from a sort of a corporate coaching perspective, because of course my approach is from the arts, being a trained actor, and then learning, using intuition, but also with a specific skill set to work your way probably down a similar path. So I'm really, really interested to hear what like one or two steps may be.
Yeah, sure. So it starts with understanding your emotions and your response to emotions. And the very first step is actually understanding which emotion you're even feeling. What is it? So very often we get this big muddle of emotions. It could be anxiety or frustration or fear, and all mixed up together. So the very first step is say, hey, which of the only 4 emotions that there are am I feeling right now? Because sometimes we think there's thousands of emotions and there's different things under that umbrella, but there's really only 4. What are they? You remember that movie Inside Out with those little cartoon characters, those little figures there? So basically fear, sadness, anger, and joy. That's it. But very often we just get this muddle of things. So for example, you could be feeling stuck. You could be feeling stuck in your life. You could be stuck in fear, not knowing how to move forward, or procrastinating and fear to take that next step. You could be stuck in sadness. You could be stuck in other ways. So it's really distilling very first the primary emotion that you're feeling, the primary emotion. And many people have primary emotions that are almost like their default one. Some people have a bit more sadness in them. Some people have a bit more anger in them. So, anger might come out as mania, manic behavior or irrational behavior. So that's the first step to develop that. And then it's about sitting with that. What's my relationship with fear, let's say? What happens when I get scared? What do I do? So really getting an understanding of that sort of on a deeper level, because everybody has a different relationship with their emotions. So it's a matter of like, if you can bring it down to the primary emotion, that's the self-awareness piece. What's the primary emotion I'm feeling? And I wonder why I feel like that way every time he says that. I wonder why that triggers every time I go to that place. So understanding the triggers that trigger that emotion so we can catch it earlier on. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. It's really interesting. So for everyone who's watching on YouTube, you can see me furiously scramble for something at the side, and I'm like just trying to grab my book, and verbatim, actually, there's the analogy I give and the example that I give in the book with emotional intelligence is sort of my audition at acting college, where emotional intelligence is trained as a necessary skill for the job, basically. So I went into audition. I did a piece from Europe, Michael Gow, basically a little lost boy who'd fallen in love with a girl from Europe, goes over to find her. She decides to leave him, broke up, lonely, alone in a foreign country, all that sort of stuff. Vulnerable, little lost boy, right? So audition rehearsed for like a week on my own, go down to Sydney, do this audition, goes well, panel of 4 directors go, yep, that was great, fantastic. Can you try it one more time? I'm like, sure. Is that cool? Try it one more time, and this time you're a salesman on an infomercial selling a bargain. You go, what? So like in any other profession, this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
Like, the scene requires this. The scene requires trust, like vulnerability, honesty, no, insecurity. That's what it requires. Sure, we're asking you for the polar opposite. I'm like, oh, okay. So the challenge and the skill set on a dime is, can you change? Can you genuinely like evoke a different emotion and reaction and all those sorts of things, right? Now this is an extreme example of skills that actors, artists, writers, singers learn and develop through their craft. Great. This is a thing you feel one way. If we want to stretch this emotional range, we're going to give you plays, work, dialogue, lyrics, music, context, themes to stretch what you have and what you know, to broaden your skill set. In this case, you're broadening an emotional skill set. Now, literally listening to your steps, the line is like, so in doing so, artistic training fosters a rigorous discipline of emotional introspection. If a scene requires X emotion, let's say it requires anger, right? You ask yourself, where do these feelings come from? How do they manifest in me? Why do I behave like this? And at the very root of it all, why do I feel like this? And the supplementary talent to this discipline is that you develop the resources to recognize and distill and process your emotions, whatever they happen to be.
Yeah.
Now, Brody talked about a specific circumstance. Melo's talking about a guy who's just disconnected from the world around him. In the world of the arts and acting, you are asked sometimes to be the jealous lover. So if I get jealous, shitty, horrible feeling, folks. But the job is to go there. And the job is to convince you that I'm going there. So emotionally, I can't cheat it. Right? So this is a heightened version of this like emotional skill set, but it's really, that's why I wanted you, Melo, to kind of go through your steps of how would you get a layperson to, how do I even feel like this, versus say a trained professional who goes, no, these are the steps I go through, and they're very, very, very similar. The only difference is most artists will sort of do a lot of this intuitively. You know, you read the thing, you can pick it up and go, yeah, you get a sense of it and you step in. Professional artists, can do it faster. Professional artists can give it to you happy, sad, jealous, angry, joyful, all in the space of like half a dozen takes, and do it convincingly. That's on the scale of emotional intelligence, that would be the difference. Now, why does any of this matter? Why does any of this matter? Well, I'll tell you, folks. I'll tell you, because my question leading into this is, sure, like, personal relationships, that kind of matters, like being able to talk to people, being able to have a happy partner, being able to express myself in a healthy way, and able to build business relationships, to negotiate and all these sorts of things. This matters, right? Can this be taught in a corporate workshop? That's my question. Yes, says Melo.
Yes.
Go on, sir. Make your case.
Yeah, to
a degree.
I was just about to chime in. I mean,
how many disclaimer?
How many sessions are in this workshop?
There's 2 half-day workshop. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the same as every skill, right? It's the same as every single skill. So if you want to run a marathon, let's say, you need to train to run a marathon. You can't just read books about how to run a marathon. You can't just go to workshops about how to run a marathon. You have to do the work. Same as meditation. You can't just read books about mindfulness and meditation or go to courses and get educated about it. You have to do the practice. So it's the same as emotional intelligence. You can understand it theoretically, and very often when I go in, sometimes I'm actually coaching a whole group of HR directors or people in culture who you imagine would be high up on that scale there. They
Okay.
know it, they may know it intellectually and they may know it
Yeah.
theoretically, but
Yeah.
it's actually the practical application of it. So we need to do the practices. So the things that I do teach are the practices. So I'll teach meditation practice, I'll teach mindfulness practice, I'll teach the ability to self-regulate. So going back to Brody, what you were saying before about those 5 areas, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Daniel Goleman's work. So Daniel Goleman has, written many books on emotional intelligence, and they're very similar areas. So the first one is self-awareness. The second one is self-regulation, which are the preemptors. Then there is empathy. Then there's motivation, and then there's also social skills. So very similar domains to what you said. I think you had relationships in there, which probably translates to social skills. So we
Mm-hmm.
need to train all of those things. We need to actually exercise those things. It's very similar to one of my coachees. I coach a professor in medicine. He lectures in robotics around the world. He's a very smart guy. When I started coaching him, I thought, how am I going to coach this guy? This guy's got like all the letters after his name.
Yeah.
He knows everything. And as I was coaching him, he said, Melo, I wrote the paper on that. Melo, I wrote a book on that. Melo, I lecture on that. I said, yes, you can know it, but do you practice it?
Yeah.
So you have to actually
Right.
apply what you learn. And when I met him, he was very close to orange stage, red stage of burnout. So he knew, what stress is. He knew he was a cardiovascular surgeon actually, so he knows all about stress on the
Yeah.
heart.
Wow.
Yeah, but he didn't apply them. So going back to the original question, can you teach it? You can plant the seed and you can give them the practices, and when they feel it, let's hope they take it home and they practice it. Because very often in my work, people will come to me months later, say, Melo, you know that thing that you taught me in that session, even if it's like a lunch and learn session, a 1-hour workshop, you know that thing you taught me in that workshop? It helped my marriage, or it saved me, through a difficult period. So then they
Yeah.
applied it. Most people, when you go to workshops and seminars, won't apply it. They just tick the box and leave. So, you sort of lead them into it, but they have to actually do the practices.
I
Yeah, I
hear
mean
you.
that brings something up for me. I feel like that's perfect. And the thing is that I think is lost, where we're like, you can't teach it, because the to quantify that is to someone put it into practice, right?
Yeah.
But when we're talking about things like emotional intelligence and the self-regulation and those kind of things, it's as much as it is a daily thing, it's not often that there's a drastic enough experience in your daily lives to put it to practice, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's when people are like, oh, they didn't learn anything from the seminar. No, they just haven't had a chance to practice it yet, right? And
Mm-hmm.
when that instance does come available, that information will serve itself to them. And I believe that. That was really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing around that is to understand what coping strategies you've put in place to manage your emotions. So really, an emotion has a natural cycle. In my eyes, it gets triggered. Let's say it's sadness. Let's say you get a trigger of sadness. It rises in intensity, and it reaches its peak, and then it dissipates down the other side. And on its peak, you will have some sort of outburst. Let's say you cry, you feel sadness, and you express it through sadness. But most people, when they get an emotion, it gets triggered and it's just about to reach that peak, and they don't like the feeling that it's happening, and they'll have some sort of coping strategy. Oh, I'll just distract myself. I'll do something else, or I'll do
Wow.
something to not. Yeah. So most people have these developed coping strategies. It could be blame. Maybe if it's anger, instead of feeling the anger and having it be blame, I blame you for that because that's much easier than riding the emotion. But if you ride the natural wave of that emotion and actually let it express its peak, and then it'll dissipate down the other side naturally and you lose the intensity of it. So it's a big one to understand what your coping strategies are.
It's a really funny parallel. Creativity and risk seem to go hand in hand in corporate and in life. And I make the cases that's not quite true. There's what you perceive as risk. And then you have this thing of risk avoidance. So it's like creativity versus risk avoidance. And the way I broke it down is the only way to combat that is actually through emotional intelligence. So let's say it's sadness, anger, anything that you like. You sort of put in a position where you feel this emotion and you place into a state of vulnerability because you have to accept that I'm angry or I'm jealous, or I'm sad, or I'm frustrated, or whatever these things. And normally with these uncomfortable emotions, the ones that we don't like, the ones that make us feel icky, we'll avoid them, or we won't face up to them. So you have a cycle of putting yourself into a position of vulnerability, and then you immediately have it's perceived as risk because your nervous system says this thing's going to kill me. You know, this uncomfortable feeling, this unknown factor is going to kill me. And so then you avoid it. You risk avoid. Now, this is a natural and healthy thing to do. The problem is if you're not coached or self-aware or critically analyze your emotions, you go, no, look, I'm feeling jealous and disappointed that I wasn't good enough. It's really, really shitty. It's not going to kill me. And you sort of move through that to a form of acceptance. And that's where you have trust on the other side, because you go through this ugly experience, realize it's not going to kill you or hurt you, or you're not less than. So you create a healthy cycle. And the point that I make is like this cycle for the individual is identical to that of the conglomerate. Like you're faced with a new idea, what you perceive as new for you equals risk. And even though I can logically demonstrate that it's not and it costs you nothing, you will still avoid it because you don't recognize it. And also this is how you find people trapped in toxic patterns, because they're only seeking things they recognize. And that is sometimes partners, friends, relationships, workplaces, which aren't great for them, but that's all I know. And so, you know, this is the cycle that we'll stay in. I guess that's the emotional side of it. There's one caveat I want to talk about before I move on to part of my rant. But I remember watching a video, it might've been Big Think or whatever it was, but it was something around like understanding emotions and understanding emotional intelligence, and just kind of cut everyone at home some slack. The way that your adrenal and nervous system works is whenever you get hurt or happy or any sort of strong emotion, right? It's basically your brain dumping a whole bunch of chemicals and endorphins and into your nervous system. And your body has no way of interpreting, oh, this is happy, this is sad, this is jealous, this is angry, this is fear, this is whatever. It just gives you a whole bunch of physical and emotional sensations. And it's up to healthy parents, teachers, coaches, people around you to help you sort of understand, like, oh no, you're just, you know, you see a child fall over once and land flat on their face and they start bawling. The minute you say, you're okay, they stop. Because they're not actually in pain. It's just like a little bit of a shock and you sort of learn to cope. So part of your adolescence and growing up is trying to interpret and decipher what all these mad rush of chemicals through your body are supposed to mean. And then we label them as emotions, and then you're trying to work with them. That sounds very complex and quite intricate and personal. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's the same for absolutely everybody. And you've got to go through this process of recognizing what you have. So a lot of the challenges you'll have, you know, all the misfits who are in their 20s per se, is actually trying to decipher and interpret what it is that your body's going through. And like Melo says, it's not generally the surface thing. You're not generally pissed at this person because you feel hurt and upset and betrayed because of something else, or like something vaguely related. But getting back to the workspace for a minute, this is my hot and spicy take. This is why I don't think that emotional intelligence is ever really going to be effective in a corporate workspace. I'll talk, if you want to, the first question you ask is, if we have a demand for emotional intelligence, then that implies a deficit. So where's the deficit come from? Why don't we have it? Why don't we have it globally across every major corporate industry, right? There's something specifically lacking there. And I write about it in the book, like how and why we got here. And the reason, one of the key reasons as well, is if you're a human, by and large, you'll have empathy. If you've ever seen a three-legged dog, if you've ever seen a kid drop an ice cream, like, you have empathy. The difference is when we step into work, The rules are that doesn't belong here. Like, you leave your problems at the door to do the job. And so you amputate this sense of empathy, care, and compassion, and you shelve a whole bunch of your emotional life as you walk in and sit down at the desk. And this is not just white collar, this is hospo, this is trades, this is across the board. This is what schooling and productivity has sort of ingrained. It's like, I don't care if you're upset or distracted, sit down and do your homework. Like, do the problem on the board. Like, you go to work 9 to 5 and you leave all those problems at the door and you can talk about it, on Friday night, drinks. Yeah. So there's an ingrained educational and professional culture where your emotional life isn't relevant. So do you really think the workshop or the HR folk are gonna solve that? And I guess, Melo, I put this to you because it's I'm outside the corporate sphere, so I can point and laugh. But it's sort of with things specifically like emotional intelligence. They go, oh, hey, we kind of need it. It's like, yeah, like everyone knows you treat your people like shit. Everyone knows HR is there to insulate the company, not take care of employees. So, and now that we're post-COVID, we can afford to be cynical and call it as it is. And now you're saying, oh, we need emotional intelligence. It's like, yeah, it's because your managers also now lack the skills to negotiate and manage remotely because you can't be authoritarian. You have no way of developing rapport. Your employees don't really like you, and now they can choose where they want to go because they're working remotely. So the game has changed, and it's a completely different ballpark. So I don't know. Is my assessment accurate, or do you think there's grey room there, or am I being overly critical?
You dropped out there a little bit at the end there, but there's a few things. I want to rewind the clock a bit there where I picked up a bit on what you were saying before around a child that falls over, for example, and we comfort them. So a lot of these emotional intelligence skills is what we develop over our growing up period. So,
yes.
And take that into work, take that into life, take that anywhere. Like, it doesn't matter what we do later. So a perfect example is you mentioned about licking an ice cream there. That made me think of an incident that I saw not long ago where a little child, 3 or 4 years old, licking their ice cream on a summer's day and dropped the ice cream on the floor. What did the parent do? Instead of coming in saying, oh, it's sad, or I understand you're angry, or deal with that emotion and let them express it, the little child was crying. The parent came up, swept up the kid and said, oh, look at the truck, or look at the aeroplane.
Yeah.
So it distracted them from their emotion.
Yep.
So what does that child learn? That child learns that distraction is a good way whenever I'm feeling sad or I'm feeling angry. So they learn that over time. So we can't point the finger at just the corporate space, but it's like we learn these skills through life. So
yes,
that's one thing, our upbringing.
Yep.
You mentioned another thing around the thread of it was around feelings and emotions. So if I ask the question, like, where do even emotions come from? Like, how do they get triggered and which emotions are? Often they come from a thought, like a little trigger will trigger us. So you have a thought, it might be a fearful thought, and then that we follow that thread of that thought until it becomes a feeling. So say, for example, you have a thought about the thing you were talking about there was risk. That's right. You're talking about risk. And you have a risk. So therefore that triggers the next thing is like, oh, what if it doesn't work out? Or what if it doesn't happen? And then we start feeding that what if thought and we start giving it energy. What if I do this project and it doesn't work out and I can't provide my family and I'm broke? And you follow that what if thought so big that it turns into an emotion. And usually that emotion will be, in that case, with risk, it'll be fear. And then with fear, we feed that fear so much it turns into an emotion, anxiety, and it keeps going until it affects us physiologically and psychologically. But at the very beginning, it was just a thought. That's all it was. It's what we did with that thought. We fed it this thing. We could also feed it the other way. Positively.
I was going to ask, so why don't we?
Yeah, exactly. We could say, well, for example, with you guys doing a podcast, it's like, oh, what if this is a failure? What if this doesn't go anywhere? What if it's actually, we're not making any money out of this or whatever. It doesn't go anywhere and I have to stop doing it. But what about if we change that narrative and say, well, what if it's the best thing that ever happened? What if it's actually a success? And instead of feeding the fear, what do we feed there? I heard you say the word, Chris, trust. And then we feed that trust. oh yeah, I trust that no matter what we're doing right now is actually heading in the right direction. And instead of having anxiety, then we get excited. And what I picked up on, Chris, what you're saying there is about the physiology that goes through the body. The body cannot recognize the difference between the feeling of excitement, anxiety, or nervousness. They're the same physiological responses, but it's more the mindset that goes with excited versus anxious. And then that will feed us positively. We'll release good chemicals, the dopamine, the serotonin, instead of the adrenaline and cortisol. Yeah, and somewhere in that, there's an emotional response. Mm. Does that make sense? It's a matter of like following that thread, yeah, or positively or negatively. So we learn all these behaviors as we're growing up, and many of us have a default, and it's much easier for the human to actually default the negative route. Mm. It's actually an easier route. It's our shortcut. We have what's called a negative bias, where we view the world negatively, and we look for fear, we look for danger, we look for things that will harm us. So we have a negative bias. It takes more effort to actually think positively and view the world positively.
Yeah, there's a line in the book when I sort of make the point. It's like, look, the honest truth about all of this is it's gross. It's a gross process, and no one really talks about this. Like, moral lessons aren't all, victories hard won. It sometimes feel like to take out uncomfortable emotions and to reason with them is exhausting and feels like a complete waste of time. But ultimately, say you're better for it. I mean, and some things, simple things that you all might identify with is like either childhood trauma or shame or rejection or the need to make your parents proud and the resentment that that's even still a thing, but these can sit within your existence. I mean, straight up, like, I'm an overachieving, overly ambitious creative driven by the fact that I don't think I'm good enough. Someone, somewhere, somehow didn't give me the space or the voice that I wanted to be seen, heard, and valued. So I've done everything I can since then to establish I can do it, I'm smart, I'm capable, I'm successful, I'm all of these things. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem to stop. I'm lucky at the moment. I can sort of manage, because I seem to burn hot and fast. So I've at least identified that, to realize that the 9 to 5 Monday to Friday work week isn't built for someone like me. So you sort of step into similar, like, contracting spaces where I get to travel and do this and that and can record a podcast with Brody. But if you wanted me, I learned the lesson working at a tech startup for about 2 years, because that was the first time I was hired, Monday to Friday, sort of 9 to 5, and I'd never done it. So I thought, okay, this is what everyone else does, right? And it was funny. Like, it was like I was baking for 2 years straight. I had hair fall out in a patch in my head, alopecia areata, from stress. And that's if you don't know, that's when your nervous system can't identify whether something is a virus or a threat or not, so it decides to kill it off. So I had a patch, a perfect circle ring of hair fall out of my head because my nervous system couldn't quantify what was going on around me. So I had to realize that, maybe 9 to 5 corporate isn't really for me. But I was convincing myself for 2 years, like, this is what everyone else does. This is what a real job is. This is what normal people do. Why can't I do it?
Yeah. Yeah. And were you aware of it at the time? So
not at all.
No,
not at all. Like, it's like going in every day felt like, climbing into a hot bath. And I felt like at some point I'll be, it'll cool and I'll get used to it. I never seemed to get used to it. And even when I was there, like, never really felt safe. Whole bunch of factors that might go into this as well. Like, I was an independent community manager for like 2 or 3 states. So I was really on an island on my own, where I've got the tech team sitting directly behind me and I've got sales sitting right in front of me. I was sort of on my own with one direct report because my other manager had just been fired/quit. Interesting relationship with the CEO, who didn't particularly care for me, but who else is going to manage your 5,000 contractors? It was so in I guess now in hindsight, whenever I was explaining like the multiple hats I was wearing to do this job, everyone's like, what the fuck? Like you had on your caseload. And I just sort of shrug and go, I thought that was the gig because it was sort of my first experience, but never really got comfortable. But then the first offer I got to leave, I absolutely took it. Like it was, but it was funnily enough in this conversation, what it was to tip me over the edge was an informal performance review after about 9 months of being there, where I was brought in to report on something else, which very quickly turned into, I heard something that you said to my executive assistant, and so now I'm going to grill you over it. Me defending myself, him, I won't say mocking me, but kind of deriding me and like, oh, well, do you want a performance review? I'm like, well, I've been here for 9 months and I haven't had one. Proceeded to get grilled for another half an hour. Then we wrapped up the meeting, talking about emotional intelligence. Then we wrapped up the meeting and he came and grabbed me 5 minutes later and said, I guess we better do the positives. And then dragged me back into a side room to kind of go through a checklist of half a dozen things that he thought I did well. And I go, okay, like there's no traction here. There's no real future. Again, like as a creative working in a tech startup, for Christ's sakes, like you're supposed to be sort of adaptive to ideas and agile to concepts. Kind of just seems like you want compliance.
Yeah,
okay.
I mean, that situation sounds like abuse of an overachiever. I mean, that happens all the fucking time. When you have someone that can wear multiple hats, it's very easy to expect them to wear multiple hats when everyone else is wearing one. That's just because you're an intelligent dude in general. You know what I mean? Like
it's nice. I know it's nice to hear a few years on sitting objectively in a podcast, but of course at the time you don't feel like you're valued.
Of course not. Of course
at all. And again, you feel like the black sheep of the entire company. But you know, I'm trying to do what all the normal people do. It's just like hold down a 9-to-5 gig.
And your experiences is obviously what shapes you, right? So these experiences that you've had that shapes you and informs you on what you see as the corporate landscape. What I do see, I work in a multiple of different industries, so it's a bit different. Where I do see empathetic leaders. I do see vulnerable leaders. One of the best campaign that I ever saw recently was when one of the leaders, the top CEO of the company, actually shared a 2-minute video of his challenge with anxiety. So he actually shared openly with the team, and that 2-minute video went across the whole company with hundreds of employees, and they were like, oh my God, like it really opened up that conversation. I didn't realize it was like that. So that's a fantastic empathetic leader that's also sharing that vulnerability and authenticity. So I am seeing the change in the landscape a fair bit. I am seeing people, and the biggest skill, I think, when it comes to emotional intelligence out of it all, like, you know, obviously the self-awareness comes first, is listen. You know, listen with an open mind, listen openly. The best compliment you could ever give somebody, one of your employees or one of your staff members, one of your team members, is your full attention. But that takes work, man. That takes work to actually train your full attention to really listen. Because often we listen to people, but we listen through our lens. We listen through
in order to respond rather than just to understand.
Right.
Exactly. So that's one of the very first steps. So when it does come to empathy, you know, one of the best skills to develop is really challenge your listening skills, like genuinely listen with open curiosity and awareness. Maybe even listen to the point of not just coming from your opinion, but maybe this person can change my perspective. Maybe this person can actually change the way I view things, and put yourself in their shoes. They may be, let's say, a parent with a young child that's been sick all night and been vomiting or whatever, and they're coming to work and they're still showing up, you know, and you're putting yourself in their shoes and listening to their story and listening with genuine compassion and kindness and, you know, open awareness.
I want to move this in an abstract direction just for a moment, because this is what I sort of flagged at the beginning, where emotional intelligence is this, it's these 5 things, empathy is the top. We spent a lot of time talking about it in the corporate space. Now, this is the sphere of emotional intelligence, which I've not seen talked about anywhere, and something that I bring up is massively, massively valuable. And that's in understanding that by and large, again, as humans, you fundamentally have it in a more profound sense than you realize. So if you walk into any art gallery, let's say, and you see giant shadowed figures all in black looming over individuals, it gives you a certain sense of chaos or dread or oncoming doom, right? You have that sort of sensation. So if you just keep that in mind, and then if you imagine at the same time, I'm going to play long, sustained, heavy bass notes, something from Jaws, like dun, dun, dun. You get a similar sensation of fear and something is coming and dread and anxiety. And if you were to watch a dance performance and to watch a figure all dressed in black slowly tread across the stage with heavy footsteps with their shoulders slumped and their heads down, you'd get this similar sense of foreboding and not everything is well. So the question I pose in the book is then, how then, without any technical interpretation, without any data points, without any understanding of metaphor or symbolism or analogy, can an artist present you with these images and sounds in this landscape, and you as an audience intuitively know exactly what's going on? And the very simple solution is because you feel it. These colors, these sounds, these movements make you feel a certain way. So if you can feel and understand a language, then you can train yourself to use and identify and employ this language. So as much as we've talked about it in the corporate space of like, yes, it is literally talking and communicating to other people and having them understand you. In a creative space, if you've ever listened to a song that was just your jam and you knew from the opening riff, music is an abstract language designed to make you feel a certain way. That's the way that it works. And what I talk about in the book is how emotional intelligence is your gateway to abstract intelligence, which is, a whole other thing. But the point is, you already have these skills. When they talk about 80% of communication is not what's said, but sort of observing body language and getting an understanding of how someone does feel. That's a clearer, more concise way to understand and identify and interpret where someone is coming from. And I never hear that talked about. When it comes to emotional intelligence, no one ever points to a Picasso and says that is a graphic depiction of war, and you all understand the weeping widow. You understand her grief. You might not be able to put a finger on how and why, but you can look at that and you can feel sorrow and grief and trauma, and something is not right with her or the world. Yeah? That's emotional intelligence. One, for you to interpret what this picture is about, and two, for Picasso to paint it in such a way that he evokes this in you. And that's an incredibly powerful thing. Brody Ipox.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, when you look at the pinnacle of emotional intelligence, that's it, right? Like when you look at a creation or an environment you're going to walk into, or just something you're going to do, and you can perceive and ultimately predict the outcome of what it's going to be for somebody else, Jesus Christ, you're really there. And I think a lot of us can poke at that and play at that, and this is just me talking personally. I don't think, as much as I'd like to believe I could construct it so accurately, I'm not sure that I could, and I don't think that takes away from my emotional intelligence. I just think it's a testament to what Melo said. I don't know if I've learned to listen as well as I think I have, and because of that, that same lens that's mine is the predominant lens, right? And I don't think you can be that Picasso type when it's only through your lens. I think the same thing when the paintings are painted or the pictures taken. The thing is that artist in that moment is themselves choosing to experience that, and one of the things I think for me personally, I'm not sure as much as I've listened and I know empathy and things like that I have it within me to allow myself to feel that deeply for someone else's situation because I haven't experienced it. And shit, maybe that's what takes away from my emotional intelligence. But at the same time, it's like that's rare. That's fucking rare. How many people can do that? How many people can make you believe that you're at war by taking a photo or painting a photo or writing a song and you've never motherfucking been there?
That's the craft. Like anytime you see a good film and you like, oh, I can picture that story and I'm in there, that's when you don't see the strings. It's good craft. And you've all seen bad television and bad film. And you're like, oh, I've seen this before. And you disconnect completely. It's the same as whenever you hear a bad cover version of a song. Like, but the reason we identify with music and song and films and all these mediums is because you see yourself there. You empathize. And that's a whole other artistic process, which I'll talk about another time.
I love this. I love this discussion. It's a great. We should have started with this because this is like the good stuff. This is the good stuff. So a lot of this is open to interpretation. I think I believe there's a universal emotional intelligence, like the one that just is. And underneath it all, we often think about the emotions, and most of them are negative in a way. There's anger, there's sadness, there's grief, and there's fear. But underneath it is pure joy. Like underneath it all is pure joy, and that's our natural state of being. And an artist, or whether it's a painting or a photographer, can evoke those feelings in you. And we interpret. So if there was somebody, for example, if there was 3 people looking at a painting in an art gallery, and it was a painting of a house with a garden and some clouds in it, and these 3 people will view it from their perceptions. Let's say one of them was a gardener. Let's say one of them was an architect, and another one was a landscaper or something like that, or another artist themselves. Obviously the architect's going to be looking at the shape of the house and the drawing of the house, and the gardener's going to be looking at the garden and the other people. So we all view the world differently, but there is a universal truth to it all. There's a really interesting study, I forget the name of it, where there's basically it's an animation, and it's got these little round dots, little round figures, and they move around in this little square, and this little triangle comes into the square, and it starts bullying and starts pecking at these little dots, and it kicks one of the little dots out of the square and kicks them out. All that is basically little figures doing little things. It's our interpretation that is interpreted. This little triangle bully came in and it kicked it out, and this poor little thing's now lonely, and we get evoked with these emotions from that. So that's the universal emotion that we have: empathy for others, care and compassion for others, wanting others to be safe and sound. So there's that. It's a good discussion around that too.
Yeah, I think, and to tie it all together, is if you look at an artist's capacity to there's a composer, there's a musical composer, did the music for all of Nolan's films. Hans Zimmer. So this is the difference between musicians and composers, right? It's like not every musicians can read music and play, but they can't often compose. Like 80%. Normally when I give a talk, it's like, can you read music and play? Every hand goes up. Cool. Anyone play jazz? Wipes out 80% of the room, because jazz is all improvised. Right. So you're not following the rules and following the notes. You've got to dynamically make it up as you go along. So you sort of illustrate a creative skills gap right there. Cool. That's jazz. Anyone compose? Bam, wipes out the other 10%. Right. Because composition of something original. Right. And this is the thing. Like Zimmer has such an understanding of music, is that these notes make me feel this way. So if I compose these notes in this way, I can make all of you feel the way that I want you to feel.
Mm.
Right? It's a layman's example of like the creative process. Think of every villain that you've hated in a film. They're specifically written and played that way for you to hate them. It's not, a lot of things go into this, but this is the point. So then, if you can understand emotional process at this level, and if you can make it craft, it means you as a leader or whomever can walk into the room and instantly engender trust, because you know how to approach different members of different teams, like Melo was saying, and listen to regulate your behavior to get the best out of them, to negotiate, to discuss. For anyone that works with international clients, you will know exactly what I mean, because there's normally different languages, different cultures, different customs of the way that you do things. And having that context, emotional intelligence is one of the key skills that lets you interpret context, that allows you to read the room, it allows you to read data abstractly. All of these things, hugely, hugely valuable. In addition to understanding people that you're talking to. So if I wanted anything from this episode, it was to demonstrate the potential, the significance, and the depth of what emotional intelligence actually entails and what is possible from it, rather than just the surface discussion of empathy, which I agree is necessary. But there's an entire world that professional spheres overlook in terms of its application and its value, and there's an entire sphere that the majority of the population look because they just go creative, and that's naturally what creatives do. And I can tell you, it's not. It is absolutely a trained skill which must be developed over a significant period of time and applied to a craft. Melo, final thoughts.
Yeah, if we went back to Brody's definition at the beginning there, we've sort of strayed a bit from there, but we've covered a fair bit of that. Yeah. Which is good.
I told you I would.
Exactly. But really it's doing that work on yourself. It is that self-work. Because if you even if you just did work on your values, what are your 3 top values? That'll inform you on who you are and what you do and who you align with. And often when we're having conversations, what we do in the initial part of the conversation is we try to find an alignment of values. And we find, oh yeah, you too, I've got kids too. Yeah, I understand. Yeah, I also. So we look for rapport. And that's important, and that's great. That's a good start. But the other thing that I like to play with is look for differences too. Like look for, oh, you're a bit different to me. I understand. Okay, let's have a conversation about that. And that opens up that awareness bubble there. So don't get caught in your own self-awareness. I mean, it's a matter of, that's a big part of it, to understand yourself on the deepest possible level. Understand the things that rock you, understand the things that upset you, understand the things that push you over the edge so we can work with them, but also understand the people around you on a deeper level also.
Well said, sir. Brody, final thoughts on emotional intelligence.
I'm excited to watch Melo's TED Talk after this conversation, because I feel like now, having had this conversation, I mean, that is emotional intelligence, right? Is the space between the stimulus and the response, right? And no, I feel good. I think there's a lot from this that Misfits can take. And one thing in particular is, like Melo said, is, work towards the self-awareness, but don't get lost in it, right? Because then it's just absorbent. It's just
navel gazing. Yeah.
It's, you're there forever,
I'm so deep. No one understands.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Melo, thanks so much for your time today.
Pleasure.
And come and sit down and riff. If folks want to get a hold of you to have another TED Talk, find us. You'll find Melo. It's pretty easy to do. Thanks again for your time, my man. Brody, that's episode 7. Episode 8 is coming up next week. Do you know what's coming up next week?
The Void? Is it The Void? Right?
Took a guess. I know you took a guess.
I did take a guess. Am I right, though?
You are right. You are right. So
it was the only one out of my list of
you had to guess 2 or 3. Yeah. And you knew it wasn't the season finale, so yeah. Yeah, Misfits, we're talking about filling the void. And it sort of ties in neatly to sort of this emotional intelligence. It's like we all overly commit to something to compensate for something. You know what I mean? It might be drinking, it might be success, it could be drugs to avoid things, it could be relation, whatever it is. We're going to peer into the void, and we're going to see if the void stares back. I think it's going to be interesting. Brody, you anticipating demons?
I've actually written notes for this one too, so I'm excited about it. I think there's a lot of psychology that doesn't get talked about in that kind of landscape. So
interesting.
We'll see.
Interesting. Milo, you can stay tuned for that one. So
yes, I will.
Perfect. In the meantime, you can listen for free and watch us build on YouTube and on Spotify. You can get all this episodes 2 weeks in advance and sexy Misfit merch at promisfitspodcast.com and support us at Camp Misfit. If you're listening to this, if you're a fan of Melo's, say hi. And in the meantime, we'll see you on episode 8. I've been Chris.
I've been Brody.
And I'm Melo all the time.
Nice. Perfect. And you stay classy, Misfits. We'll see you on the next one.